'cause you're here to see me now.
Welcome to Contour, the podcast, the story we inherit, and the struggles that shape us. Contour is about the questions we dare ask about fate, identity, society, and the human story. If you find this episode valuable, make sure you like and subscribe so that you are notified of our next episodes. Welcome to Contours of Life with Clement Stephen Dachet. In this episode, we are looking at faith, fear, and freedom, focusing primarily on understanding Nigeria's new CPC, or Country of Particular Concern designation by the United States of America. Something to know about Nigeria is that it is a deeply religious state nation. Nigeria has over 200 million people. It stands as Africa's most populous country and one of the most religious nations in the world. Surveys consistently place Nigeria among the top countries where religion plays a defining role in daily life and personal identity. About half of Nigerians identify as Muslims and the remaining half as Christians, making Nigeria home to one of the largest Muslim populations and one of the largest Christian populations globally. Despite being constitutionally a secular state since independence in 1960, religion remains woven into the nation's political, social, and cultural fabric. Through the decades, faith has been both a source of unity and division. In the North and Middle Belt, waves of communal violence have reflected not only religious differences, but also ethnic competition, land disputes, political rivalry. The introduction of Sharia law in 12 northern states between 1999 and 2001 marked a turning point, reigniting debates about the secular character of the Nigerian Federation. The rise of Boko Haram in 2009 ushered in an even darker period. What began as a radical movement in northeastern Nigeria evolved into a decade-long insurgency that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. Offshoots such as ISWAP, Islamic State of West African Province, and smaller militant factions like Lakurawa continue to destabilize the northeast, northwest, and north-central zones. Nigeria has consistently ranked among top 10 countries most affected by terrorism on the Global Terrorism Index since 2015. On the international stage, these dynamics have drawn persistent concern. The United States first designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern on 7 December 2020 under the first Trump's administration, citing severe violations of religious freedom. In November 2021, under President Biden, Nigeria was removed from that list, a decision widely criticized by rights advocates. Now, as of 31st October 2025, Donald Trump has re-listed Nigeria as a country of particular concern, warning of possible sanctions or aid suspension of the government if the government fails to act. The Nigerian government has rejected this move, arguing that the violence is driven by terrorism and criminality affecting all faiths, not persecution of one group alone. Today, Nigeria stands at a crossroad. Faith continues to inspire resilience and hope, yet religion remains deeply entangled with politics, security, and identity. The challenge, perhaps the opportunity, is to move beyond accusation towards truth, justice, and coexistence. And that's where our conversation begins. I am joined by Yusuf Zariyi, who will introduce himself shortly, an advocate from northern Nigeria who brings first-hand perspective on what's happening beyond the headlines. Together, we will explore Nigeria's religious landscape and meaning behind the new designation and where hope might still be found amid the tension. Yusuf, you're welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
Before we get into the big policy debates, tell us who you are and what has shaped your voice and your work in this conversation.
My name is Zariyi Yusuf. I am from Zonkoa, part of the heart of the Middle Belt. I was born in Kano. I grew up with a good understanding of the dynamics, the differences between people, and that has helped me to appreciate people from different backgrounds. I am a teacher. I'm a university lecturer. Formerly, I've been a former national coordinator of the Middle Belt Patriots, a group basically that came up primarily to confront the false narrative that basically covered up the genocide, as at the time that was hidden, especially under the past administration. In the past, immediate past general election, I was a spokesperson of the Big Tent, the Independent Campaign Council, to one of the presidential candidates, Peter Obi. I am a husband, I'm a father. I think most importantly, I call myself a Christian, a soldier of Christ. So, by way of introduction, I would say I'm a lover of humanity. Freelance, I have reached out to communities, make on the spot assessment of affected communities by Islamist attacks. I have tried, within the resources I could raise, to get relief to those people, either medical supplies, either foodstuff, or certain other things that I think they would need. And that basically has been my life. That basically has been my passion. The fact that there is a serious evil happening, and it does seem nobody knows about it. The world doesn't know about it.
Thank you, Zari. I can see from what you said, you're truly a son of the northern part of Nigeria, born in Zonkoa and raised in Kano, one of the famous states of northern Nigeria. May I know, how has growing up in the north sort of shaped your view of religion and coexistence among people of different faiths?
Actually, I was born in Kano,
Okay.
and I'm from Zonkoa. So I was born into a very conservative family. My mother, for instance, would say we must learn to communicate first with our language. Then we could learn any other language outside. And that was basically what happened. So hardly do you find anybody in our home that cannot speak the language. But Kano is the most conservative state. I do not even think Sokoto, that is being shared as the seat of the caliphate, is as conservative as Kano in matters of religion and culture. So I grew up there, and one of the earliest things I understood that made me understand I am actually a bit different was one thing: the word infidel. Of
Mm.
course, in the local language, in Arabic, they say al kafir. Of course, in the Hausa language, they say kafiri, arni, and all of that. We grew up at a certain point with a shallow understanding of it as maybe it's just a slur, maybe because we don't pray like them. We're from a different part of the country and we live here and all of that. But the older I grew, I had a deep understanding of the limits to which a lot of things happen. My father was a police officer, God bless his soul, and I saw a lot of things about him. He came back home and he told us stories about what made their work easy, what made them difficult, and all of that. And I will just round up by saying something that struck my mind while I was growing up. We had a neighbor. I wouldn't know if to call him a Christian or a Muslim. He was an excellent choir master. He wrote songs. But even as a child of, say, 7, 8, 9, I remember we would go to his room. Sometimes we find him on the piano composing choir songs, and sometimes he was on the mat praying. And we grew a little older to understand that that sort of aided his promotion in the police force. That means his conversion to Islam. So, growing up, the older I grew, the more I appreciated the difference between us, what was interesting about it, and what was pathetic about it, especially as it concerned certain major decisions that didn't just affect individuals, but communities, and now the country.
Thank you so much for that, for sharing that. And I just want to ask, so you, as a child, grew up knowing that you were a minority because you grew up in a predominantly Muslim community or state.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. So you started experiencing discrimination, or what? How would you put it?
Well,
As young
my,
as
my,
that.
first, my first encounter with that was while growing up in the police barracks. We attended the police nursery and primary school. But not long afterwards, when we were enrolled, our parents couldn't run it because it was quite far from where we were. And then they brought in a commandant. We called them commandant. Then in the barrack, it was a police training school. So he said they would no longer take us to school using the police vehicles. So every parent who wanted his child to school in the police nursery and primary school must find a way to get them there. So our parents started doing that. But he became strict with when they reported in the office. So when it became difficult, we were all moved to a primary school, Zawachiki Primary School, a community just about 2 kilometers away from the barrack. So a lot of times, sometimes we trekked, sometimes our parents, those who had cars, those who had motorcycles, those who had bicycles, took us there. Now, getting into the class, by virtue of our names, by virtue of our sort of lack of the basic knowledge about sometimes the 99 names of God and all of these things, we started seeing the difference. And that was what introduced me to the word army. And
Okay.
becoming,
And your reference to the 99 names, you're talking about Islam in this context.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah.
So because,
And was it a public school you went to?
yes, it was a public school. That was a
Yeah.
public school, government-run school. So once a teacher walked into the class, the assumption is everybody should know that. Of course, throughout my stay in that primary school, I left when I was in class 5. One, we did Arabic, we did IRK, virtually every routine you put the Muslim child, we did. Somehow, I think our parents just had a good understanding of the culture and the context we were in, so they didn't fight it. They just gave us an excellent Sunday school, excellent Sunday school teachers. So at that early stage, we were made to understand that they may do it in class, but deal with it in an academic sense. But we never allowed it to touch our faith, even though some they would say, you are an infidel, or no, you don't touch this. Especially when it got to maybe you needed to ease yourself, and they say, no, it's infidels who stand urinating. You would need to squat down. And of course, our uniforms were typical of the Islamic school students. We had this cap that was just somewhere around here. We had our uniforms that had side pockets. We had our trousers that will not touch the ground so much, and all of that. But our parents seemed to not have a problem with that because it was the context in which we found ourselves. So they just did the best of the homework they could do, and they let us go to school. And so I think that shaped my understanding of, okay, we can only blend to a certain extent. But the moment the issue of faith came, it was very much obvious that perhaps we may never blend in that regard.
And I think you pointed something very important about how much faith means to Nigerians, and it feels a lot. But when it begins to be used to define people, who is and who is not, who do I belong to and who I'm not, how was it for you to navigate as growing your identity as a Nigerian? Was it easy within that kind of context to see yourself as a Nigerian in a context where you were treated first by your religion, or of which you belong to or don't belong to?
I think, let me tell you something that happened in my first year in the university. Of course, I was a remedial student. And when it got to be, the point of being absorbed into 100 levels in the university, admissions were, competitive and all of that. And the deputy dean, who I also saw something, who had more power to admit students than the dean of the Faculty of Sciences, because the deputy dean was a Muslim from Kano, the dean of the Faculty of Sciences was a Muslim, I think, from the southwestern part of the country. So while the position was bigger as a dean, but the power was more invested with the deputy dean. So I was in his office, and I told him, I said, well, I've checked the list, and my name is not there. And he said, well, you go back and check it. And I went, I checked. He said, what is your surname? And I said, Yusuf. And he said, yes, you would find a name that is just Yusuf. Look at it and look at the number. And I checked and I noticed this is my application number. What happens to the first name? Okay. Now, obviously, the first name betrayed the fact that I am not an indigene and I am not a Muslim. So my assumption was in the course of that competition, somebody needed to help me out. And so on my admission letter, when I got into 100 level, you would find only one name, Yusuf. And I remember very well standing in front of him, and he said to me, when you get to the Department of Biological Sciences, which was where I was admitted, he said you could put whatever name you want, but first do the central registration. Pay your acceptance fee and do the central registration. When you get to your department, you release all the rest of the details. Coming from the background of where I did my primary school, I had a good understanding of what that meant. So it wasn't an issue for me. But frankly speaking, it was a difficult thing finding my identity as a Nigerian. So it was more or less, I would first identify as a Christian. I would first identify as a man from Zonkua. But getting hold of a common value that different people, especially of different faiths, will say, I am Nigerian. That sort of shook it so badly.
So now let's come to another, take that from the personal story and personal experience to Nigeria as a nation. And I want us to look at Nigeria's religious landscape and history, laying the groundwork for our listeners to understand. Because we've now looked at your life in Kano and also your through primary school and your entry to university. Can you help us understand Nigeria's religious makeup? How do Islam and Christianity spread across the nation, and particularly also northern Nigeria?
Well, Islam has it has a strong strongholds in Sokoto, the seat of the caliphate. And I would say this to you in the light of a conversation I had with an old researcher who is not even in the country. While he was a student in Ahmadu Bello University, Zaria, a number of them were selected to carry out some form of research. And I think it wasn't primarily with regards to religion, but I think part of the information they captured, gave an idea of the distribution of, religions and ethnicities and all of that. And he said when they came back and compiled their result, he was surprised. He was shocked about Sokoto. Because he was more like, do we actually have this percentage of indigents that are Christians? Talking about Kano, talking about, of course, at the time, Katsina was not a state. That was a long time ago. Katsina State was not a state. And he said that baffled him. But as a young student in Ahmadu Bello University, he didn't see anything. He just felt it was an academic stuff. So once the results were taken from them, after he graduated, did some work, left the country, when things began to look different, he wished he had that result. So I'd say in the northern part of the country, where especially the Sharia states, where you have either the Muslim, the governor and the deputy are Muslims, the governor, deputy Muslim, the governor, deputy Muslims. There are states where, for instance, let me begin with Kaduna, where I usually refer to as a prototype of the Nigerian state. Kaduna State basically strikes those who are not in the state as a Muslim state, but it has never been that. It's roughly a case of about 55 to 45% Christian to Muslims, which would be odd to many people.
And for the sake of our audience, when you say Kaduna State, it lies in the northwest
Yes,
of
it
Nigeria.
lies in the northwestern part of the country.
Yes.
It lies in the northwestern part of the country, especially the state capital and the northern part of it. And then the southern part of it, where I come from, geographically speaking, lies in the middle belt. But we've been lumped up. And I may perhaps in the course of our conversation, we'll talk about how those things are. Now, but it happens that the difficulty in giving a clear idea of the religious distribution in Nigeria comes from the fact that Islam has appeared to be dominant, not population-wise, but dominant in terms of political dominance and all of that. So more or less, let me give you an instance. It may not be a good example. If there were 100 people in a room, and then possibly 60 happened to be pacifist in nature. But then the other 30 turned out to be those who dictated what channel to watch, who dictated what to cook, who could actually throw out the pot if they are not okay with what's cooking. And the story keeps going. There's a tendency those 60 will look like a minority. So that's the first thing I would want to put out in that regard. So, but the distribution we could roughly say or debatably say it's about 50-50, where you find 50% of that huge population, about 250 million, practicing Christianity, the other half practicing Islam. Now, among those who practice Islam, I'd say a higher percentage of those who practice Islam, possibly 80%, would be in the northern part of the country in states like Sokoto, Katsina, Kano, Zamfara, Bauchi, Borno. And then when you go down south, you would find a sort of an uneven distribution of those who practice Islam down south. But then the strength of it would be in the northern part of the country. And then in terms of Christianity, you find a lot of, as a matter of fact, most of those from the southeastern part of the country are Christians. And then a serious part of the middle belt are Christians. And then also, even those states that are quite conservative, for instance, Kano, for instance, Katsina, for instance, Kebbi, Borno, there is a serious population of Christians. And then you talk about Gombe, where there's almost a 50-50, distribution. So averagely, on an average scale, the strength of the population of Muslims lies in certain states of the north, where you would have sometimes ranging between 50 to about 80% Muslims. And then the strength of, the Christians spreads across the middle belt down south. So in the middle belt, you'd have roughly about 80-90% in the Christian dominated states. And then you go down south, it's almost either 100%, or you may find few who not necessarily are Muslims, but either atheists or adherents of African traditional religion.
And this brings me, as you talk about the makeup of Islam and Christianity spread across the nation, let's look at the north. Is the middle belt part of the north?
The middle belt has never been a part of the north. The middle belt is that particular region that did not fall to the Danfodio Jihad. By the composition of the ethnic nationalities in the middle belt and their geography, they have had intermarriages, they have had communal, intertribal wars, they have built alliances. And I think I was talking to a historian at some point from southern part of Kaduna, and he spoke to me about the Baju people and the Kagoma people having some form of military alliance at some point. So the people in the middle belt, by virtue of their culture, don't share so much with the north. An example is I am from southern Kaduna, but I am referred to as somebody from the north central part of the country. However, it would take me an average of 3 hours from the heart of southern Kaduna to come to the state capital. And in about 25-35 minutes, I will hit the heart of Plateau State in the middle belt. And as I drive down, I come across tribes with whom we share culture, we share words, we share names, we share history. Okay, like the
So just a quick question there. Would you say then that, because oftentimes there's a conflation between the word middle belt and north central, which you rightly say, and in light of the rest, the entire north, would you say that geographically middle belt is part of the north, but culturally, based on your explanation, they're different?
politically speaking, the name of the North was imposed on the Middle Belt because of political dominance. A typical example is one part of the North they refer to as Northeast is Taraba State. Unfortunately, when you look at the Nigerian map, Taraba State is farther down south than Oyo State, that happens to be in the southwest. So it did look as if what I'd say the colonialists did to give an advantage to the Muslims the Hausas and the Fulanis, through whom they did the indirect rule because they had a certain structure of the emirates. What they did was everywhere above on the north side of the river Niger, they just called the north, even though by the geography of Nigeria, it was part of the south. So it left an entire region from southern Borno, from Adamawa, from Taraba, from southern Kaduna, southern Gombe, down to places like Niger, Kogi, and all of these places. It forced them to be under, the political dominance of the North. So oftentimes you would hear people say, the North has the numbers, the North has the numbers. It comes as a result of that political nomenclature. So it's just a political coinage that you refer to that place as North Central. But geographically speaking, by looking at the map, that's Middle Belt. And that's why from the emergence of our independence, the formation of political parties and all of that, we have a history of wanting to have had that identity, which the colonialists basically refused and felt they needed to give an advantage to their indirect rule customers. And so they lumped everybody into it. So the notion of a North Central, if you would ask me as typical Middle Belt, and I will tell you it's an oppressive coinage that has basically created most of the problems that we suffer today.
Great. Because this brings me to another issue, and that has to do with the marriage of faith, politics, and religion in the northern part of Nigeria since, let's say, since 1960 when Nigeria became independent. We saw in 1999, when Nigeria returned to democracy again. In 2001, 12 northern states adopted Sharia law. How did that change the social atmosphere in Nigeria?
The adoption of Sharia law was one born out of political, religious fanaticism, and two was a rebellion against a Christian president. I would remember, of course, not something that was shown on TV, but it was said that once that idea came, the then president Olusegun Obasanjo did roll out the possibilities of that creating a problem. And once he said that, the Muslim governors who were not okay with him began saying it is their religion, blah, blah, blah. And the moment they left the meeting, they began declaring Sharia in their states. And that did not go without a lot of bloodshed, especially in a place like Kaduna State, a part of the North Central. So, which Kaduna, I would restrict my example to Kaduna State because it was a controversial issue in the state because of the proportion of Christians to Muslims, the ratio of Christians to Muslims. So, do we do it in this state? Do we not? Do we do it in this state? Do we not? So the Muslims began yearning for it. And so they'd come out and they'd do their rallies, they'd do their protests saying, we want Sharia, we want Sharia, Sharia is pride, Sharia is their fear, Sharia is our pride, Sharia is their fear, it won't affect you, it's just for us Muslims. So it did look like a token, it did look like a trophy, that they needed to clinch. And one day the Christians said, well, perhaps we should also come out and say we don't want it because of the nature of the state. The very day the Christians stepped out, a lot of them didn't return home alive. It was bloodshed. Now, that gave an idea about what would lie ahead. Zamfara went on to do it, and Niger went ahead, a whole lot of other states went ahead, and it looked as if that was what they needed to appease themselves. I saw it, one, of course, as fanaticism, but another way I saw it as a rebellion of a certain group of people that were not comfortable with a Christian as the president.
So, one, is it okay then to assume that there is in the North a sort of an assumption that that the North needs to exact its influence as as having a common religious and cultural identity over the rest of the nation, so that they don't get marginalized, or so that they prove that they are dominant in Nigeria?
As a matter of fact, your question, I would have started answering your question with something that happened during the military junta under Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, where a certain group of people, one of whom was Sheikh Mahmoud Gumi, smuggled the country into OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, thereabout. Of course, my detail of it is a bit sketchy, but what I can recollect from that is when it happened, it was a rumor. Is it true that Nigeria is here? Is it true that Nigeria has been registered and all of that? And even though, as a military president who was a Muslim, there was a good understanding and an appreciation of the ethno religious diversity of the country. So he wasn't sure. And then it was decided that the best way to deal with it was to leave it as an ambiguous matter. Because if we said, no, we are not a member of OIC, the Muslims already getting excited that the Federal Republic of Nigeria is a member of Islamic countries, it will become a problem. And if we said, yes, we are registered, the Christians will revolt. So it was left, and people weren't really clear about it. I think that was what began to instigate the notion of either politicians or military officers or clerics to feel, hey, we have a jihad to win. So when Sharia came, it looked like once you look at the country and you drive in and they say Sharia state, Sharia state, Sharia state, practicing the laws of Islam and all of that, it looked like, wow, it was something. So it's the North's way of trying to prove a certain dominance and perhaps I'd say some maybe delusion of grandeur. You know, the feeling that if a so-called multi-religious state, we practice our own kind of law, in the country. So it was more or less, I think it was Islamist in nature. It's Islamist in the sense of the use of political power to achieve religious dominance.
Because with the implementation of Sharia law, there's some that have argued that the Sharia law was only intended for Muslims, and you say 80%, about roughly 80% of the far northern population is Muslim. Wouldn't it be their right then to want to be governed by Sharia law? Although Nigeria is a secular state, doesn't have an official religion. What's your take on that when people say, Sharia law would not affect the non-believers or the people, or the faith? It will only have impact Muslims because that's what they want to be governed by because they are the majority. And if democracy is for the majority, wouldn't this logically make sense?
Actually, to be honest with you, it's not meant for the Muslims because a lot of us have looked up to or looked at the Sharia states to see what happens to thieves, to see what happens to politicians who steal money, to see what happens to all manners of crimes. But what we realize, the length to which most of that has gone to is primarily the oppression of women. Why is she having a TikTok channel? Why did she snap this picture and put it on her Facebook profile and all of that? Kano, for instance, has been more popular for such things, talking about the dressing of women and all of that. And it impacted Christians more in Kano State. Reason is that it almost became, or it's more of an economic sabotage against the Igbos, who, of course, as Federal Republic of Nigeria, you could do your business everywhere. So he moves alcoholic drinks, wines, and all of that. And then somebody stops that truck and he destroys everything. And he records it on TV, and people say, yeah, the Hisbah police have done something. Sharia state, Sharia state, Sharia states. So while it may look like because they are at least maybe 70, 80% in the state, they have the right to be governed by a certain law, unfortunately, they are not living in isolation. They are not in a country of their own. They are under the laws of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. So another Nigerian from the southern part of the country comes to do business. And once it doesn't fit their own practice of religion, they destroy the business. I think that's economic sabotage. Yes, that's it. I can't go there and raise my pigs because he's not okay with it. But of course, a whole lot of things when you reverse the case, It's different. So it does look like we need you under our feet. So that's why I said it's more of an oppressive tendency.
That's very interesting, because so we've not only seen the rise of a desire to want to have a Sharia law in northern states as we return to democracy in 1990 in Nigeria, but there was also something that started emerging uh, almost a decade almost a decade later, and that is the rise of extremism and terror in Nigeria. I think for many people, when they hear of northern Nigeria or they hear of Nigeria, they think of Boko Haram. Is often what draws people's attention, and that's what people begin to think. Now let's unpack how this unfolded. How did Boko Haram begin in 2009, and how has its ideology evolved over time?
I may be disagreed with, but the implementation of Sharia law in those 12 northern states, if you'd ask me, is the complete or the total foundation for the emergence of Boko Haram and every other Islamist group. Reason being, once they were able to implement Sharia, contrary to the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, what they were doing now was, here is the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which is multi-religious. Some people will say it's not secular, it just recognizes the fact that there isn't a state religion. So it's on one side. And on the other side, they are running Sharia law. So which means we practice both. And once it passed the first year, the second year, the third year, and it became obvious that, well, actually we could lynch somebody if he insults the name of our prophet. Actually, we could destroy alcohol. Actually, we could raid hotels when we feel possibly there is something going on and we're not comfortable with it. Actually, we could stop the airing of certain programs. Actually, we could restrict certain rights of people, especially when their daily lives seem to be things our religion does not accept. Once that began to pass, the notion of Boko Haram came simply to complete. So Boko Haram is more like the fulfillment of the Sharia law. So while the governors who are in politics, who shake hands with the capital city in Abuja, are running Sharia by the side of the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, the Islamic clerics, the teacher that founded the idea of Boko Haram, wanted a situation where completely lay down the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and have a full-fledged Sharia practice. That was where it began. It began with the teaching, it began with recruiting. Let me give you an example. I was in the university one time. I'm not really sure, but story came that there's a group called Boko Haram. Oh, really? Yes. Actually, they pay a whole lot. If you're a geographer, if you know how to do, if you know how to, if you are good with the GPS global positioning system, if you were an engineer, if you were this, and they paid a lot. I remember that at the time they said about 45,000 naira weekly. So I didn't really connect that. But they just said they were not a group of illiterates, they were a group of educated people. And what they wanted was that there should be a complete ban on Western education and a complete doing away with the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and a full implementation of Sharia. So I don't disconnect the emergence of that Islamist group from what the governors did uh, at early years of the 2000s.
So again, like you said, there was the in Nigeria's history, the north, there was the Sokoto Caliphate, which was a caliphate. I mean that it was predominantly ruled by
Okay.
Islamic political system. So would you say that the Boko Haram, because in their real name, which I don't want to say now because it's such a long name in Arabic,
Yeah,
roughly translated means a return to the fundamental teachings of the Prophet and jihad.
that's right.
But of course, their nickname as Boko Haram, which loosely is in Hausa, would mean, education or Western education or civilization is forbidden. Is it an expression of a quest to return to this what is termed the golden era of the caliphate of the north?
Yeah, and ironically, by the use of gadgets, invented by Western education. Yes, it is. Basically, the mission is to get to a point where I walk on the street and I find your daughter who is 13 years old. And I say to her, "Why are you walking alone?" And she said, "No, my father sent me to buy sugar." And I said, "Well, you've come of age to get married. And I know that man is not Islamic enough. So we could just take her and keep her somewhere and marry her off." A return to that era where what did he say? Oh, okay, that's an insult on our prophet. So we could pull you to this market square and we could slaughter you. In places where Boko Haram have conquered, that is how the people live. There are gory videos that a lot of us don't even want to share. So they gather the community and they say, "This woman did this man did this man did that." Well, they are holding their guns. And well, the worst of it is they would kill them. So you'd expect, shoot them and let them die. But somebody brings out a knife and he literally, slaughters another human being. And people are shouting, "Allahu Akbar, Allah," whether it's out of love for the law or out of fear for what could happen if they don't celebrate it. But in Nigeria, I'm talking to you in Nigeria, in places where these Islamists have had this power, they do those things. So it does look like that is what they want to return to. That is the future they see for the entirety of Nigeria, basically.
Thank you. And we've also seen that over the years, Boko Haram has evolved and has also devolved into splinter groups. So we have a variety of insurgent groups right now, or terrorist groups. Do you think they're all interlinked, and do they all work together, or they are just like different splinter groups out of Boko Haram? Because we have the Lakurawa, we have the ISWAP, etc., etc. What is the formation like? And one more thing, just to add on that, is that we've also seen that majority of Boko Haram's activity have over the years, of course, with isolated cases outside of the northeast, have been restricted largely to the northeastern part of Nigeria. So, would one see that as a national problem or just a regional problem?
Well, it was initially localized in the northeastern part of the country under the rule of the PDP, because the attitude of the PDP government, even though they didn't do excellently in terms of dealing with the security issue, was not to negotiate. So actually, they were at the verge of completely crushing Boko Haram. Now, I would say something to you. The most popular commander of Boko Haram, Yusuf Shekau, it is said that when the international terrorist organization ISIS, I think, either reached out or it looked as if it was time to pledge allegiance, but he had grown so powerful, fought, fought, and fought, and fought, and fought, to a large extent, as at the time the military began getting compromised, because there are all kinds of stories that one may not necessarily love to share, but it did look as if a lot of soldiers died they always die in an ambush. A lot of things looked somehow, something always sabotaged their efforts. So a lot of officers died. Once he was killed, certain sections began swearing allegiance to ISIS. So it looked as if he wouldn't do that because he was too powerful, but certain people under him, looking at the chance of better funding, better equipment, weapons, and all of that. So that made it easy to kill him, because some would say the military didn't kill him, but the stronger group that came took him out. So, but they still maintained the Boko Haram name. And I think one of the reasons for their localization in the northeastern part of the country is that the leaders were predominantly Kanuri, of the Kanuri tribe. Those who sprang up from those groups, like La Kurawa, Mahmuda, and spread down to the axis of the north western part of the state, coming to the north central, they took different forms. Prior to the Lakurawa and the Mahmuda emergence, in the northwestern part of the state, they were either kidnappers or bandits. And then,
Yeah, so I will just step in here now, because this brings me to the other side that I want to talk about, because the Boko Haram was the northeast, and then of course we saw the rise of banditry activity in the northwest,
that's right.
almost like the opposite direction, you know. So while jihadist groups dominate headlines, another reality that has taken root is the rise of banditry and mass kidnapping in the northwestern and north central. Many now call it an economy fear, they call it the economy of fear. You know,
Yeah.
who exactly are these so-called bandits operating in the northern part of northwestern part of and north central part of?
Yeah, the former governor of Kaduna State, Nasiru El-Rufai, would say they are not as bad as the secessionists in the southeastern part of the country. They are just business people. They just kidnap, make their money, and that's all. To the best of our understanding in the Middle Belt, especially as Christians in communities that have come under heavy attack, these are Islamists. This is my understanding of what's happening. Boko Haram has already been proscribed, and by so doing, legally, there is a measure of aggression the military can unleash on them. But because the aim is not to be localized in the northeastern part of the country, the groups that kept springing up would have to spread down to the northwest and the north central, which I would refer to as the Christian fortress. I call it the Christian fortress because it is basically primarily the region that has stopped most of the operation down south. But how do you find an Islamist group in that region without it being proscribed? So it looked as if coinages would have to come up so that while they pursue a similar agenda, they are seen as something else entirely. An example is in the Middle Belt, initially, when the mass killings began, they were unknown gunmen. As a matter of fact, some people will tell you that it would amount to a crime for you to attach their identity or their religion because they are unknown. But more communities began to share a common denominator by the same kind of attacks, by the same kinds of people, and by the same chants they do when they kill people. Okay, so fine. Why do you have to kill a nursing mother, the baby she is carrying, and the other kids in the house? Why do you need to kill a 90-year-old man who basically is just living his life hoping to die anyway? Why do you have to attack and then go to a community, possibly those who have central maybe barns where they store grains and certain other things, destroy that? Why do you have to pick their equipment for irrigation and destroy everything? So it looks as if we kill you and we cripple your economy. And then they leave scouts behind. Each time it looks as if some people are trying to come back to the community, another attack comes. So it's likely in the Middle Belt you find a lot of communities that have been empty for at least 5
So
years.
your take is that this are the same group, just wearing different masks.
Yeah, that's right.
In that,
Uh,
yeah.
there is one of our late, I call him the lone voice that roared in the Middle Belt was Obadiah Milafia. He was one time a deputy governor of the central bank. And he made an interview that was interesting, especially those times when some of them either got arrested and some of them claimed that they were repentant. And he said they have told them that basically it's the same mission they are pursuing. He said during COVID, when movement was restricted, a lot of hardware, a lot of their people were moving to different parts of the country, the Middle Belt, down south, under different names. They call them herders. Okay? At some point when it became obvious that predominantly the ethnicity of those who killed people the most in the Middle Belt were Fulani, they began the story from the unknown gunmen, then the story of Farmer Haida clash came up. So, but mostly between 2015 to 2023, it was a difficult thing to tell the world exactly what was happening. The narrative was against us. There was the story of climate change induced crisis, farmer header clash, and all of that. Even though the reality on ground was completely off those stories, it was difficult to convince the United Nations. It was difficult to convince people, internationally, because hey, come on, we know there's climate change. We know people who need to feed their animals and people who raise crops will always clash. But
Yeah.
let the world know that it wasn't a clash. It was one armed group, sophisticatedly armed. I'm talking about RPGs, I'm talking about AK-47s, coming to communities and basically killing people in their hundreds in one night and then just leaving. And then another day, they choose another target and they do that and they leave. Another day they choose another target. So it was a very difficult thing to convince people about what was happening.
Yeah, let me, because that's also what I have worked with for a number of years. Because when you look at available statistics, whether it's in terms of economic statistics, Nigeria has a has a good economy in parts of Nigeria, but when you look at where poverty is high, is actually in northern part of Nigeria. And if you look at also in terms of Human Development Index, the rate at which education is in northern Nigeria is actually abysmally low compared to the rest of the nation. So, and also when it comes to the issue of climate change, which I think that's the argument for people who are looking at environmental impact assessment, would argue that the exacerbation of desertification in the northern part of Nigeria has sort of made some of these herders who have used some of the routes in the northern part of Nigeria to graze their cattle, because of the absence of green area now, urbanization, climate change, and all of those things, that people are now forced to go down south, and therefore that the crisis we see in the north central, owing to the destruction of lives, and it has been popularly termed now, that this has sort of led to the clash between uh, herders and farmers. And we know that most of these farmers predominantly live in the middle belt area, who are largely Christians. But that's been the excuse. But you're saying that beyond that is actually a cover. Or am I correct in
Yes,
that assessment?
yes.
Yeah.
Because the world has given a lot of focus on climate, a lot of focus on climate made it easy to easily slip an expansionist agenda below, in it, to just slip it through below the radar, and many people would not know. It would have been understandable if the killings were only during the rainy season, but I mean, people get killed in their hundreds all the time, and if it's all about feeding the kettle, what brings in the chanting of Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, a lot of times when attacks take place, and then secondly, why the government tends to be more proactive in suppressing the story of the victims than basically even ensuring that their lives are guaranteed. So that's one of the other questions we've been asking. An example is like now, when people talk about a Christian genocide, you'd realize somebody will tell you there is an international campaign the Nigerian government is launching. You would think is seeking help to end terrorism, but they will tell you to counter the narrative that there's a Christian genocide. So it's more or less, why is the government active in denying the plight of its own people than accepting what it is? So I think because of the focus of the world on climate change, climate change induced crisis and all of that, the Islamists have managed to realize that it's an easy cover, because initially when they sprang up in the northeastern part of the country, they came out plainly, this is what we want, and they were quickly proscribed. But spreading to other parts of the country and doing that, they need a good cover, and they have found it in climate change. That basically is what I'll say, especially from the position of a victim of this genocidal massacres.
So looking at this diverse, from the terrorist group to the bandits, and all having this umbrella of Islamic extremism, one would assume that the immediate victims would be Muslims, because if they are the predominant. So I guess the question is that it has something to do with a recent debate about the Christian genocide, which you have hinted a little bit into, because the violence has been called by some, especially in Western advocate cycle, as a Christian genocide. But we also, like we've looked at those other economic and other. Is there really a Christian genocide, and is it happening in the north, in the majority Muslim part, or is it just around the Middle Belt region?
When Boko Haram first came, a lot of pastors were killed. But one of the kinds of stories we had was, well, he wasn't attacked because he was a pastor, okay? Maybe there was a restaurant close to his house and there was a gas explosion and he died. I remember there was a Christian school in Kano that was attacked a couple of years ago. Obviously, a suicide bomber got to the school and attacked it. bled a lot of students. But the story was that it was a restaurant nearby that, a gas cylinder exploded. So, but then everybody in the restaurant was safe. It's just the school in the other, part that had a problem. So, from when Boko Haram came, it did appear that the narrative was being suppressed. Boko Haram came out and said, "This is what we want. Do away with the Nigerian constitution and give us full-scale Sharia." But the politicians from northern part of the country, especially the Muslims, kept saying, no, it was the matter of economics, it's because they don't have jobs, it's because the economy is harsh, it's because of this, it's because of that. So most times when the early victims began saying, no, they're actually attacking Christians, all kinds of narratives suppressed it. I remember I was in a church in Kano when a woman, I don't know whether she was sanctioned by the government and all of that, stood in front of us and told us that Chibok, that first major abduction,
Yes.
that Chibok was not a predominantly Christian community. The girls, that what happened had nothing to do with religion. But actually, it was religiously motivated, at least for the fact that a precondition for releasing the girls was simply denouncing their Christian faith. And I think that was one of the things that made Leah Sharibu's case popular, because she refused to do that. Now, once that began to happen, it looked as if there was the strength of the government as at the time was to fine-tune the narrative so the Christians don't feel scared about it. When it began to shift to certain other places where communities were attacked, where people were killed, an example is there was an indigene of Plateau State that was going back to school in Maiduguri in the northeastern part of the country. Boko Haram stopped the bus, isolated him, killed him in front of the camera, and said they were doing so on behalf of their Muslim brothers on the plateau because it has also faced certain clashes between Christians and Muslims. And let me just round up by making this point. There was a point in time when these clashes, when we could actually refer to them as clashes between Christians and Muslims, it happened in the centers, in Kaduna, on the plateau in Jos. The Muslims attack, and the Christians can identify it is from this community, and so they attack. Okay, this ones will burn down the mosque, this ones will burn down the church. But it looked as if it died down, and then something else sprang up. What sprang up is this Islamist militia. But their activities, the killings were no longer mutual. The Islamist militia kept pressing into the Middle Belt, killing Christians, but you don't have a Christian militia pressing against them or finding their base in any Muslim predominant state like maybe Yobe, like maybe Sokoto or Kano or wherever. So it looked one way sort of. But then the narrative, like I said, in all of these killings, it looks as if the strength of the government is to create a narrative where, although Christians are being killed, it doesn't look that way.
And to be fair to your argument, we have seen a video of the former Minister of Information of the previous administration of Nigeria under Buhari, purportedly saying that there was an attempt by this group to go after Christians, primarily. But his argument was that they were doing it as a way of turning the country against a Christian Muslim, to fight each other. That was the argument, that there was not, one would not say that there's a genocide, but it was, yes, but there was a targeted attempt at Christians in order to create this unity in the nation. So basically, what we're saying is that we've seen, when we go back, there has been that argument for Christian genocide. But where we are right now is that there is an argument that there is no Christian genocide in Nigeria. How does that tie in together? With
So in those years when it became obvious that Christians were specifically targeted, the narrative you mentioned was, wait, Christians. It's not as if you are being deliberately targeted, okay? There is some force from elsewhere that is trying to use this group to incite you to violence and create a clash between Christians and Muslims. That was manipulative. That was deceitful. That was a lie. That was a strategy of cooking a frog by gently adjusting the heat to convenient, temperatures until it dies and gets cooked. That was basically what happened to the Christians. It was not because you want to ask yourself for over 2 decades, who would want to start a religious war by arming only one side? I was thinking if I could sustain mass killings of a particular group for 1, 2, 3 years, I could turn around and give the other group and say, now you need to defend yourself. But we don't have a Christian militia group. All we have is a proliferation of Islamist group year after year. They get more sophisticated, they get more people. I mean, you need to see when they call them for what they say peace talks. They used to show up possibly in 2025. Now they come in hundreds and they sit down with their weapons, with their chains, with everything. Sometimes you find those who would even be their victims, who are supposed to be their victims, cheering them because of the sophistication of the weapons they've displayed. They hold their meetings and they go back. Now, that kept going on. But so the Christians were relaxed while these Islamists kept growing in number and kept killing people. It is because of the idea that, or the notion that it is not actually aimed at, it's not a genocide, it's not aimed at Christians, it's just meant to instigate violence, it's just meant to make the Christians to fight back. But then we have had mass graves for almost 20 years. So if somebody wants to start a violence, they would have found a way to start off a Christian militia. But that has never happened anywhere. With all of the pains, with all of the mass graves, with all of the cries, nothing of such has happened. So it is actually a genocidal massacre. And basically the aim of it is Islamic expansionism. That's the best thing. We have, as far as the victims are concerned, that is what we see every day.
Yeah.
Yes.
So how do we then balance the tension or the recognition of attacks on Christians communities on one hand, and also with the awareness that there are also Muslims who have also suffered mass killings?
Now, let me start with something that happened in the Middle East when peace was brokered between Israel and Palestine, or I'd say Hamas. One of the first things Hamas did after that peace treaty was to cleanse their streets. Basically, there were public executions of people they termed collaborators, likely people they felt sold information to the Jews or people that didn't hate the Jews enough. One other thing people don't talk about is who is doing the killing and who are being killed in those parts where we would say the Muslims are also killed. I can tell you it is Hausa Muslims that are being killed. There is a certain political coinage, Hausa Fulani. It doesn't exist actually. It's a political coinage of dominance. The Fulani man is a Fulani man. The Hausa man is a Hausa man. The very way we can say there is any tribe called French Italian. Those are separate nations that don't share even words in common. When these attacks happen and you hear people being killed in Sokoto, of course they are Muslims. You hear people being killed in Zamfara, they are Muslims, but they are Hausa Muslims. So to a large extent, if they would look beyond the religious ties, if they would look beyond, hey, let's cover this up as fellow Muslims, and actually cry out, you would understand it has a genocidal connotation to it. Because you can't go to Katsina or Zamfara or where the Muslims are being killed and find 30 or 40 dead Muslims or Fulani people or Fulani women that have been taken for ransom and are being raped night after night and all of that. They don't pay ransom. The house.
So yeah, and so just to get that, you would say that the term Hausa Fulani is actually a qualifier for the Fulani, not for the Hausas.
That's right.
So in that way, it would be the Fulani who speak Hausa, or the Fulani who live in the predominantly Hausa land.
That's right. That's why you find out that all of the emirs in those ancient Hausa kingdom have all been replaced by the Fulani. But the notion of the Hausa Fulani is not because there is any such tribe. You are either a Hausa man or you are either a Fulani man. And once you
would it then be okay? Is it okay? Is it safe then to think that the Hausas are actually the most marginalized people in the north?
Yes, I would say the first immediate victim of these Islamists would be the Hausa people. But it's easy to not see it because a lot of them are Muslims.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. there was a massacre of over 1,000 Shiites in Zariyi. When the Muslims began saying, it's not a Christian genocide, we also get killed, I kept waiting to find one Muslim that would cite an example with the Shiite massacre, but nobody did. Surprisingly, a couple of days ago, a protest was led in Kano, and at the forefront of the protest was the Shiites, and their language was that there is no such thing as a genocide in Nigeria. And I could come to the conclusion that the reason why we don't see the pattern of the killings of Muslims, to understand that while it is being carried out by Islamists, it has an ethnic connotation to it, is because once it has to do with religion, it looks as if we are more comfortable being killed, but it's more or less, it's okay for the Muslim to kill another Muslim. More like
And you're right, because I think that there is that convolution of terms when we talk about religion, ethnicity, and politics. Sometimes the line gets blurred and people don't see
that's
it.
right. That's right.
And which makes the northern case sometimes a bit complicated, because then the so-called majority minority, in this sense, who do not have political influence, then get marginalized and nobody hears their voice.
That's right.
Now, let's move a bit forward, because I'm just thinking in terms of the role of the U.S. government in the recent, marking of Nigeria as a country of particular concern. This designation. The U.S. first listed Nigeria as a country of particular concern in December 2020, removed it in November 2021, and now it has been relisted again. What does this designation actually mean for Nigeria?
Well, the designation was done by President Donald Trump the first time, and when the Biden administration came, the Democrats, it was removed. That may not be a subject for today, but we've had all kinds of interview with, key players in the ruling party when they were in the opposition, and we saw how they lobbied against the president. They ensured arms were sold to him, and one of the reasons was that the war against Boko Haram was a systematic depopulation of northern Muslims. So it became difficult for the government to fight Boko Haram, and they had to resort to the use of mercenaries. Now, so a lot of things changed. Once Trump put Nigeria on the CPC list, these killings sort of changed. It went down, it died down. What it means for Nigeria is that the international community is now watching. The international community will no longer give you the kind of support it gives you. The international community will hold you accountable for those lapses and all of that. And then it did look as if beyond the people carrying out the killing, the foot soldiers, the international community will look at enablers within the ranks of the government. But the APC, led by Buhari, who was part of the people that led the team that frustrated the efforts of the previous government to crush terrorists, ensured that once the Democrats came into power, Nigeria was immediately taken off the list. We understand that the APC or General Muhammadu Buhari would not have even gotten into power. Of course, we are not talking about politics, but we attribute his ascension into office, getting into the presidency, to the Democrats in the US as at the time. I mean, there are so many conversations either with the mercenaries that were contracted by politicians in the present ruling party, and then by a whole lot of things, even by the testimonies of the president, Goodluck Ebele Jonathan. Now, removing Nigeria from the list, how it affected Nigeria was that it gave room for rapid growth of the Islamists. An example is there is a group called Miyetti Allah. Miyetti Allah is supposed to just be a sociocultural group, but it grew in strength such that it got to a point of taking responsibility for mass killings on the Plateau and Benue and southern Kaduna. In other words, you could go and kill 50 or 60 people. And yet Allah will say it is because 5, 10, 15 of our cows got missing, so we took action. When the people say Miyetti Allah is a terrorist organization, I think a couple of times, I think the Middle Belt Forum, the Christian Association of Nigeria, had called for the proscription of Miyetti Allah and the arrest of leaders of the group. The federal government then, headed by General Muhammadu Buhari, who happened to be a patron of that group, refused to do it. When the people say Fulani Islamists are the ones killing us under the umbrella of Miyetti Allah, they will deny it. But whenever they meet the community and say to them, well, possibly if you give your land for ranches, they will stop killing you. The other people at the other end of the negotiation table would be Miyetti Allah. While denying attacking people, they are always on the other end of the table to negotiate the terms of surrendering the land of the people so that they will stop being killed. So that thrived. And then one way or the other, the Nigerian government became friendly to terrorism. In the Northeast, you find them being flown in airplanes, being put through de-radicalization programs, while women who have suffered rape, while children whose parents have been killed, while communities that can't return back home are just wasting away in dehumanizing conditions in IDP camps. At some point, we had about 40,000 refugees in Niger Republic because of the activities of Boko Haram. So I wonder how anybody feels in the refugee camp, possibly looking at the TV or looking at the phone and seeing their killers being driven in buses with new clothes, shaking hands with military officers, with government officials in the name of de-radicalization. So it appeared the government, as at the time, saw it as an opportunity to appease their fighters, because a lot of them had said, because there was, sorry, I'm taking a bit long, because there was amnesty for Niger Delta militants who had a problem with how oil was destroying their community, that now it is the turn of the North to pamper its own freedom fighters. Some people refer to them as freedom fighters. Some refer to them as, even though they are terrorists, they are our brothers in Islam and all of that. So it was as if the government needed to flaunt how much it catered for those terrorists at the expense of their victims. So reassigning Nigeria as a CPC, basically, if you look at the ups and downs going in the country, the propaganda of the government saying we killed so number of terrorists, we killed so number of terrorists, it means it will put Nigeria on its toes. Heavy funding. I don't know if there's another African country that got as much funding from the Democrats, from Americans, from 2015 till now, like Nigeria, in terms of money, military hardware, and training. But the terrorists kept growing and kept becoming normal. Prior to the coming of this regime, it was not known that they would ride on bikes, possibly for 1 or 2 kilometers, come into a city center, sit down with military officers, community leaders, clerics, hold a meeting, and go back to their camps. But now it is looking as if it's normal, such that a planned elimination of the terrorist is being openly rejected by Islamic clerics and northern leaders.
And because I think there has been mixed reaction, largely I think also both within Nigeria and outside of Nigeria. Within Nigeria, I think we felt, I kind of see there are two sections in northern Nigeria. There are those who, although Muslim, welcome the idea, but then there is majority those who feel like this is a direct affront on Muslims in Nigeria. But that's not the way I understood the words, or rather the tweet or the X post of the president. Because it says that if the government of Nigeria didn't take an action to change it, that they would step in. But in what measure? Of course, it's clearly the issue of not giving Nigeria further aid and maybe selling military hardwares. But somehow it's been interpreted as a fight against Islam in Nigeria, which sort of makes it a bit complicated down in Nigeria again, because you say on one hand it's against the Islamic extremists, not against not against Islam in Nigeria. How has this been for you? Because I remember you were on an interview with the popular sheikh in northern Nigeria, Sheikh Gumi, and that was one of the things that both of you spar on. And he was saying that America should not come in, and Nigeria should pull off any relationship with America. because he thinks that this is an interference in Nigeria. But I guess that's not the position you see
Well,
it.
the reason why the interference of the United States of America is being rejected by most Muslim clerics is because anything that cripples, anything that eliminates the Islamist fighters basically thwarts the advancement of the jihad. That primarily is the whole thing. When Goodluck Jonathan, the then president before this party came into power, was at the verge of crushing Boko Haram, a popular Islamic cleric by the name of Sheikh Isa Ali Pantani kept preaching sermons, sometimes in tears, saying he does understand that Boko Haram is a proscribed group of terrorists, Islamic extremists, but they are their Muslim brothers. They cannot be killed like pigs. The Sultan felt it shouldn't be. General Muhammadu Buhari, who later became the president, said it was a war against the North. It was unfair against the North. So it does look like, although they are terrorists, the mission they have to accomplish, which is the full, the establishment of Sharia, Islamization, tends to be something that appeals to the sympathy of even the Muslims who may not necessarily pick up guns and kill anybody. And that is the reason why, as at the time, it looked as if the effort of the government to eliminate terrorists, especially when the mercenaries came in, was seen as an attack on Islam. And I think that is the reason why, even though they kill Muslims also, you hardly hear of such stories. Because more or less, there's a bigger plan ahead. When you find them kidnapping people, collecting ransom and all of that, it's part of what they do to sustain themselves. But the bigger picture is Islamization. So to anybody that believes in that Islamic conquest, he will definitely have a problem with any force that plans to eliminate these Islamist fighters. And that is basically how I understand it. But it's not an attack on Islam. It's an attack on Islamist fighters that does appear to be a sabotage on the idea of Islamization.
Thank you. We'll go to our last segment now, which is the wider experience and pathway forward. You've talked a bit about the so-called de-radicalization, rehabilitation, and resettlement of Boko Haram fighters who are now called reform fighters. I was in Nigeria in April, and 2 days after my arrival to Abuja, there was an attack in the outskirts of the city of Jos in a small town called Kwal in Miangul area. And I decided to go there to see what was happening. And because sometimes living outside of Nigeria, you don't really understand the extent of the damage. So when I was there, I was really shaken and really deeply heartbroken to see the level of devastation that had occurred in that community, with over 55 people, killed, houses destroyed, and I just imagine how many children have been orphaned and women turned into widows or men turned into widowers. I spoke with some of the community leaders. They told me that from similar attacks over the years, they have over 517 widows that have emerged out of that kind of crisis. So when I think about these people, some of these people are living in IDP camps.
That's right.
What is the state of the internally displaced people? At the point, there was like millions of them. What is the state, and what's the government doing to help rehabilitate and reintegrate these people back into normal life, return them to their normal homes?
I first appreciated the pathetic situation of the IDPs when in 2022 there was an attack in December where people were killed in Kaguru, in the southern part of Kaduna. That should be in the north central part of the country, but it's in the middle belt. And I met the people and I took food items to them. So there is a Reverend Father, the Magaji, who said to me, I want you to see something. He took me around the community. I saw how an entire community was razed down. He showed me at this point they killed somebody, here they burnt somebody, here they slaughtered somebody, and all of that. And this is supposed to be the IDP camp. And I said, where are the internally displaced persons? He said they were told by the police that that will not be recognized as an IDP camp. So that forced members of the community to have to absorb people. Of course, your cousin takes you in, your child takes you in, your uncle, and basically that was how they were scattered. But one of the things I understood was that one of the reasons why the IDP camps are not catered for, it does look like not a failure, it looks like it's deliberate. Because if you don't see the IDPs, if they live in subhuman conditions, they would be forced to return homes, to other places to stay. And by so doing, you don't, whereas the region suffers massive deaths, you don't find activities of non-governmental organizations. They are all focused in the Northeast. And the Northeast does not measure 20% of the killings in the Middle Belt. So it looks like a strategy to suppress the idea of the mass killings that happen in those places. Because at first I said, why would the government have a problem with an IDP camp? At some point in Kagoro, they were told if they choose to stay there, they would be doing so at their own risk. So he says, so once in a while, what they do is if people need to address them, they just send message across, the community, and then they gather, people talk to them, pray with them, and they leave. But staying there became a problem because officially the government did not want to recognize it as an IDP. Because once it's recognized as an IDP, international organizations that meet the needs of the IDPs will be there. And that will signal that there is a human crisis in that place. But somehow they refuse. So I think the situation in the IDPs is deliberately planned by the government. And it's an unfortunate scenario. There is no plan for trauma healing. Nobody cares about supplements. Nobody cares about the babies. Nobody cares about the moral, upbringing of the children that grow in the IDP camps. There are some that have lived for 10, 8, sometimes 12 years. And the best infrastructure they've seen are the classes of the primary or secondary schools they've been occupying since they were sacked from their community. So it's a poor thing. The government, I can actually tell you the government does nothing as far as the IDP camps in the Middle Belt are concerned.
Wow. And just to ask, which is one of my last questions, what can faith leaders do, and young people do, to actually close the sectarian divide? Is it possible? Is there hope for Nigeria?
There is hope for Nigeria if the religious leaders would look beyond selfishness and extremism. Selfishness on the side of the Christian leaders. I have seen many of them that have tried, that basically have been blind totally to the mass murders all of these years, almost 2 decades. But all of a sudden, because the Americans have said, Nigerian government fix this issue or we will have to come in and protect the victims. Then somebody mounts the pulpit and tells the Nigerian Christians, somebody who has never said anything to them all of this while, hey, don't embrace this help. They want something else. They're coming to destroy you. Okay, let's just live together. It's better we stay. The devil you know is better than the angel you don't know. And on the side of the Muslims, I'd say they look beyond extremism because there is always that feeling that, well, they may be terrorists, but it looks as if it's a certain cause they are pursuing, which is Islamist in nature. So there tends to be sympathy, like if you had followed my interview with Sheikh Mohammed Gumi, you would realize he is so vehemently fighting for the rights of the terrorists. And
He calls them
yeah,
their people.
yes, he said, our warriors in the forest. That's what he said. As a matter of fact, he has a sermon where he told his followers to not vote any candidate that has a plan of eliminating the terrorists. That was when he referred to them as our warriors in the forest. He has a sermon where he said that. So that is one way for the religious leaders to look beyond selfishness, cowardice, and extremism. I don't know if that would ever happen, but the only hope is that If it gets to a certain point, you will have to organize people to have a common front, speaking about defending themselves, because it's a right that every living species would feel the need to defend itself once its existence comes under threat. So we would have to look at that and then hope that they would remove fear and confront the government on this security issue. Otherwise, I am of the opinion that a renegotiation of the Nigerian state might be necessary at some point, especially considering the fact that some people believe it just has to be Sharia in that extremist sense, while others are just okay living with each other regardless of the differences.
I mean, I initiated an organization called Midpoint. We're based in
Okay.
Denmark, working in Nigeria, largely because of the crisis and the needs that are in northern Nigeria. So, if you were to speak directly to the international community, most of my listeners, I'm sure they would be from Denmark or Scandinavia. What would you want them to understand as a last word?
One of the things I want them to understand is that the humanitarian crisis in Nigeria's middle belt is worse than what you have in Gaza, is worse than what you have in Sudan. It's worse than what you have in Nigeria's northeast. But it has just been not ignored but suppressed, deliberately kept under the radar. So we would love organizations to come in, interface with these people, and help meet their needs. Why I don't look up so much to the Nigerian government in that regard is because it is still, as of today, denying the reality of what's happening to predominantly the Christians in Nigeria's middle belt. The other thing I would look out for, from the international community is to prevail, their moral authority and all of that, to prevail, to put mechanism in place to prevail against the Nigerian government to ensure that the people that have been displaced from their homes are returned to their homes. We don't want to get to a point where people are displaced and then something new happens. A new set of people colonize the place. So you come to the IDP and you say, well, we'll build new houses for you in safer places. So you go. It simply means victory for the Islamist. Because once you find a community where the original the indigents cannot go back, you would rather find the Fulani are either living there or they have left their cows to ensure nobody returns. So it is important to make sure those killers get eliminated and the people are returned to their homes, and possibly prevail against the United Nations, the United States, and the Nigerian government to consider the option of a referendum. By that I mean the peoples in Nigeria coming together on a table and saying, let us look at this issue and deal with it from its roots. Possibly there might be a group of people that would want to go alone and practice something they are okay with, or possibly we will renegotiate our terms together if we have to proceed as a single entity.
Yeah, that's very true. And indeed, from the deserts of Borno to the valleys of Plateau in the Middle Belt, the story of northern Nigeria and Nigeria cannot be told through one lens alone. Indeed, religion, poverty, and politics have collided here, but so have courage, compassion, and faith that we've seen exhibited by ordinary Nigerians who reach out to help. The challenge is not to pick sides in Nigeria, but to recover our shared humanity and rebuild trust where fear has taken root. Yusuf, Zariyi, thank you for helping us see the fuller picture from your perspective.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.